Story number 1. 5 days are missing from my life. The caves kept them and returned me reshaped. The first time I heard my own name spoken from stone, the air turned colder and my lungs forgot their rhythm. I went below to measure echoes. I came back carrying a message that will not stop repeating inside my head. Physics taught me how sound behaves. The mountain taught me what a voice will do to survive. If you go where the map ends in Carter County, do not call out your name. I am Langston. At 28, I was certain the world would behave if I brought enough instruments. Carter County offered limestone, long passages, and a legend about returns that do not match departures. Day 1 was clean. Readings aligned with models, and every reflection obeyed its geometry. On day 2, I left the last marker and entered a chamber so large my lamp thinned in it. I said a simple test word. My name came back, followed by a clear warning not to go deeper, spoken in my cadence. Training steadied me. I mapped the span, spoke a control line, and listened. The reply ignored delay and delivered new content. The entrance I used would fail in 10 minutes. I checked the corridor. Nothing moved. I begged for a malfunction and got perfect readouts. So I asked who was speaking. The answer, me, 30 minutes ahead, using whatever strange property lived in that room to project backward. Then came instructions. Left at the damp fork. Up the ledge that looked unreliable, but would hold. Avoid the inviting. Even floor. When my headlamp flickered, the voice told me to swap battery packs before the first died for good. I obeyed. Seconds later, the old light failed. One command cut through everything. Run. I ran. The place I had been standing a moment earlier collapsed into a raw basin. After that, I did not argue. I let the other me steer until cold air touched my face. The guidance said our lines were about to separate. It said I would live, but I would not be the same. Then it was gone. Outside, rescue teams were preparing to enter. My 3-day plan had stretched to 5. I could not remember. Back home, files that should have held the exchange were clean, except for a faint smear where my memory insists there were words. I learned a new tone that rises whenever the world falls quiet. In it, I sometimes hear my name, the way the stone said it. I no longer chase a model of that room. If a framework exists, it sounds like this. Shape and mineral turned time elastic, long enough for a failed version of me to send survival instead of equations. To anyone who goes below, measure carefully, mark your roots, and if the mountain returns your voice with better instructions, obey. Story number 2. They say a lens teaches you what to fear by showing you what you missed. I learned that lesson in a cathedral of trees where noon looked like the inside of a shuttered room. I went in to count rings and textures. I came out counting silences. The last normal thing that happened was the sound of a zipper. The next was a circle of eyes that decided to stop pretending to be animals. I hadn't meant to trespass on anything sacred. I was there for work, for the kind of assignment that sounds modest in an editor's email and grows into a private religion the moment you shoulder the gear. The grove waited where maps turned to contour lines, and contour lines turned to guesswork, a depth of hemlock that the day could not reach. I hiked by intention rather than light. timing myself to arrive on a moonless night so the forest would be honest with me. I wanted to see what the world refuses to reveal until darkness grants permission. The animals in the Mananga National Forest stopped blinking at exactly 11 or 47 p.m. I wish I could tell you I misunderstood the hour, that I misread the watch or invented the detail later to make the horror neat. But my body remembers time better than my mind, and everything in me still tightens at 11:47 p.m. As if a hand I cannot name closes around a dial I cannot see. Before that moment, there were hints the way a negative hints at an image before chemicals call it out. A low cloud of scent where soil turns mineral. A pressure in the ears, the sort you get when an elevator hesitates between floors. A curtain of branches dense enough to feel like architecture rather than growth. I pitched my small tent in a bowl of root and duff, and the canopy collected the darkness until the dark had weight. I assembled my kit like a ritual. Carbon legs locked, gimbals balancing, batteries checked with the devotion other people spend on prayers. My plan was simple: long exposures, experimental films, digital backups for safety, aimed at translating ancient bark into the language of light. The forest had another plan, and I was the subject rather than the translator. At first, I welcomed movement. It meant the place had not closed itself to me. It meant there were neighbors. A body slipped between trunks at knee height. Something paused in the understory, with the stillness of a thought about to become a decision. A branch lifted where there was no wind. I opened the lens to forgive the dark and waited. Every time I changed positions to photograph a different section of the grove, I caught glimpses of eyes reflecting my camera's flash. I told myself I was collecting peripheral data, not warnings. Dozens of pairs of eyes appeared and disappeared, positioned at various heights throughout the forest from ground level all the way up into the canopy, like punctuation marks around a sentence I had not learned to read. I am not proud of how long it took me to understand that I was the sentence. There are doctrines you cling to when your life has been spent near animals. Each species guards its own night. Territories abut, but do not weld. Fear belongs to the small, boldness to the large, and a camera flash disrupts both in equal measure. The eyes belong to different species that should never have been gathered together in one location. Raccoon, deer, something with the mass of a bear and the patience of a stone. And then shapes that violated taxonomy, the way fever violates sleep. I tried to make evidence the way a drowning person tries to make air. The moment I focused, the watchers adjusted. The creatures would shift positions with synchronized precision that did not belong to instinct. They moved like a rehearsal. They moved like an answer to a question I hadn't asked. I took frames that showed only trunks and voids where reflections had been. The grove accepted my light and returned ignorance. A ring formed, and I realized geometries were at work. The largest bodies drifted inward, where I had left my tent and stove, not to scavenge, but to station. Smaller bodies climbed and held position above, not to feed, but to observe. There were corridors between trees that a human could choose when frightened. Those corridors narrowed. I could feel thought applied to me, an attention with edges. The truly horrifying realization came when I noticed that none of these animals were making any of the sounds you'd expect from a forest full of active wildlife. The metabolism of the place had been rewritten. Even my breath seemed to dissolve before it could disturb the air. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of something that refuses to share space with sound. I learned that then. I said my name once, a habit I have in remote places, a way to staple myself to my body. The syllable went nowhere. I could not tell if the grove swallowed it, or if I withheld it at the last instant out of superstition. I could not tell if the name helped or marked me. As midnight approached, the formation of watching animals became more elaborate and sophisticated, and I tasted metal the way you taste a coming storm. I walked 3 paces, and animals moved to block potential escape routes I had not yet chosen. I turned the other way, and something pre-positioned itself where I would be if I changed my mind. I had never been predicted before. I had only been seen. To be predicted is to have your freedom measured for tailoring. I tried bargaining with reason. Maybe a chemical spill had drawn them. Maybe a magnetism in the bedrock distorted instinct. Maybe my presence pressed like a bruise against a web of territories. And what I read as unity was only simultaneous discomfort. But the collective intelligence that seemed to be controlling these creatures was learning from my behavior in real time, and reason withdrew the way a tide withdraws, leaving a landscape of exposures. The animals began moving closer to my campsite in a coordinated advance, and the word that finally arrived was not pack, not herd, not flock. The word was formation. There were bodies I could not classify, limbs proportioned for 2 strategies at once, eyes set at angles, intended for prey and predator simultaneously, fur that didn't reflect the light so much as advise it to keep its distance. Some of the eyes belonged to animals that seemed to be amalgamations of different species. I wondered if I was seeing the future of adaptation or the past of a secret. The circle tightened into intention. And then the moment that still haunts my nightmares came at exactly 11:47 p.m., when every single pair of eyes visible in the darkness suddenly stopped blinking. Imagine a room of strangers deciding to breathe together. Now imagine they decide not to. That is what it felt like. Dozens of individual animals had somehow merged into components of a larger collective consciousness that treated my presence as an equation to be solved with minimum waste. I have been looked at by predators before. This was not predation. This was audit. I have been surprised before. This was choreography performed on the inside of my skull. I have been alone before. This was being surrounded by a single thing, pretending to be many. If the forest had a face, it had turned it toward me. If the night had a will, it no longer needed the sky to express it. I began to pack, as if packing were a spell. Zippers, caps, straps, coils. Each motion was answered by the ring, as if my decision created theirs without delay, demonstrating a level of tactical awareness and prediction that suggested they understood my intentions before I'd fully formed them myself. The ground underfoot felt deliberate, as if my boots were instruments and the soil an instrument panel. Panic teaches economy. I chose a direction with less certainty than faith, and discovered faith is a tool with edges. What saved me was not bravery or cunning. It was a distraction I will never identify. A wind the canopy acknowledged without sound. A shift of weight in a distance I could not measure. Some distraction or priority shift that caused the formation to temporarily lose its coordination and create a gap in their surveillance perimeter. I ran, not to escape, but to choose. Choosing was the only rebellion left to me. I left behind everything heavy and everything expensive. Metal, glass, warranties, pride. I carried water and one lens because some part of me believed the world would be different if I kept a piece of it with me. The grove offered obstacles with intention rather than randomness. Young trunks arranged like questions, roots arched like warnings, stones positioned where a misstep would slow a life. I learned to accept small cuts to avoid large consequences. I learned to trust momentum more than maps. Behind me, the formation flowed the way a solution flows when poured. It did not chase. It corrected. Where the hemlock thinned, the correction weakened. Where the sky showed a seam, the seam parted. I did not stop to count the interval between breaths because I didn't want to give the moment the dignity of measurement. Choice after choice led to less forest, and then to merely trees, then to the kind of trees that permit weather to exist. When dawn found me, there was more world than fear around me, and that imbalance is the definition of survival. I reached a road I had not planned to meet, a ranger station I had not intended to trust, a tap that gave water without condition. I told less than the truth and more than a lie, and the report became wilderness disorientation combined with equipment failure because institutions have to call things something. Years measure themselves by anniversaries of what you refuse to repeat. My career adapted to sidewalks and skylines. I learned to point glass at reflections that cannot surround you. Now, 28 years later, I still can't look at woodland creatures without remembering the synchronized way those dozens of pairs of eyes stopped blinking simultaneously. If I pass a stand of conifers dense enough to change the light, I cross the street like a man avoiding a former lover who knows his middle name. I have tried to decide whether the grove was a unique convergence or a revelation of a rule we prefer to ignore. I wonder if that impossible gathering in the hemlock grove was an isolated incident, or if there are other places in the deep woods where individual animals have somehow merged into hybrid collective entities, not supernatural, only older than our categories. Perhaps the forest tried an experiment millennia ago and kept it. Perhaps it tries again whenever a human brings enough attention to make a shape worth studying. If there is a meaning, it might be this: we are not the only intelligence that likes to look from many angles at once. We invented cameras to synchronize perspectives. The forest invented something else, creating the horrifying impression that dozens of individual animals had somehow merged into components of a larger collective consciousness that was now focusing its complete attention on my presence in their territory. We pride ourselves on focus. The grove taught me what it feels like to be focused upon. When clocks slide toward 11:47 p.m., I still feel my eyelids grow reluctant, as if they remember a command not to close. On those nights, I sit where I can see a window and a corridor at the same time. I keep water near and metal far. I avoid the lonely courage of headphones. I let the city make its ordinary noises so the silence cannot gather edges. I am asked sometimes by students, by readers, by the rare editor who has heard a rumor of the rumor, what I would do differently. I would carry less. I would learn the shapes of corridors before entering a maze. I would name the fear earlier, so it could not grow in the dark under a pseudonym. I would remember that attention is a verb with two directions, what you give and what is given to you. The forest gave me a kind I could not carry. I tell them this: if you ever find yourself in a place where eyes shine from more heights than you can account for, do not say you are being watched. Say you are being studied. A watch ends when the hour changes. A study ends when the subject is no longer useful. Make yourself useless in the most human way you can. Become unpredictable, even to yourself. Decide without rehearsal. Refuse to provide data that aligns neatly. And if you can, let 11:47 p.m. belong to some other species, because somewhere beyond the highways and the floodlights and the curated trails, there are hemlock groves that hold the night like a vow, and in them a collective intelligence that found a method to distribute its gaze among fur and antler and wing. It does not hate us. Hatred is a simple tool. It does not love us. Love is a story we bring. It performs its work, and if you wander far enough with the right combination of curiosity and arrogance, that work might include you. If the grove ever calls me again, I hope I am wise enough to fail to hear it. Story number 3. I did not drive into the valley looking for a miracle. I drove in to prove a footnote. I did not expect the houses to be tidy, the beds turned down, the calendars forever nailed to one forgotten month. I did not expect the air to smell like bread that no oven had baked in half a century. I did not expect neighbors who had outlived their bodies, nor their precise politeness at the hour of supper. And I certainly did not expect the invitations to follow me home across 20 years of mail routes and faculty lounges. I was 45 that March, a scholar with a grant and a difficult conscience, the kind that comes only after too many tidy conclusions. My field notes were always straight, my citations correct, my boots usually too clean. I told myself that this trip to the hills was merely a survey. Photograph the storefronts, sketch the floor plans, record the line where a company's profit had ended and a town's heartbeat had drained away. What I did not tell myself is that I went looking for a story I could own. The logging road rose and fell like a tired breath. Ruts the color of old tea, trees bare enough to show the ribs of the hills. My tires found a rhythm. My doubts did too. On the passenger seat, the folder labeled Grafton Settlement, new paper trying to swallow an old name, held clipped maps, land deeds, a handful of missing newspaper notices that read like half-erased apologies. A Xol County archive had coughed up a roster of company houses, numbered instead of named, men and women, once listed by shifts and debts. I promised myself I would give them back their addresses, if not their peace. The town arrived with no ceremony. It simply perched there at the valley's narrow, as though nature had parted its hands long enough to let a settlement collect on the palm. I parked where the store's porch shaded a rectangle of earth that still remembered footsteps. Window glass nodded back my reflection. A man who looked like he believed that absence could be archived inside. The air had the stillness you learn to call studious in musty reading rooms. Shelves marched in orderly ranks. Labels faded to the color of river stones. Prices penciled in a clerk's careful hand. My camera liked the light and told me so with each calm shutter. I wrote observations with the contentment of a man who has not yet seen anything dangerous. Stock intact, vandalism minimal, dust in suspiciously short supply. I told myself these facts were a curiosity, not an omen. The homes kept their dignity with a stubbornness that made me a little ashamed. Sofas that had held family arguments, no one would win. Quilts washed by vanished hands. Calendars bolted forever to the year when someone decided hope spent too much on coal. Children's playthings waited on floors for voices that would not return to call them by pet names. I have spent my life telling students that communities erode like creek banks, grain by grain. But this one had not eroded. It had paused. That was worse. I will admit now what I did not write down. The valley carried a hush unlike weather, unlike neglect. It had the hush of a choir inhaling before a hymn they know by heart. I was still scribbling the word preserved when I learned what it meant to be preserved against one's will. The first neighbor I noticed did not arrive with a startle or a rattle. She simply stepped into my view the way a memory does, already in progress. An older woman at a clothesline, hands working through a routine so practiced that it had outlived purpose. The fabric sagged like paper left in rain years ago. Yet she straightened each pin as if Sunday inspection still mattered. I opened my mouth to introduce myself, to offer the polite intrusion of scholarship. Her face turned toward me, and I understood more than I wanted, that the body can be unfaithful to time, and yet the motions go on. Her gaze was careful, neighborly. The terror arrived not with her appearance, but with the courtesy of it. I had met performance before, historic villages with costumed guides who narrated wages and weather. This was not performance. This was the muscle memory of a town continuing its household verbs after the sentences had ended. I watched men at a slope where a mine mouth had been sealed, their lunch pails swinging with the confidence of wages already spent in imagination. I watched porches swept clean of dust that returned as if called. I listened, not to voices, because what they moved through was older than speech, but to cadence, the ledger of life kept by hands. I wish I could tell you that I backed away at once. I did not. Curiosity has a way of pretending to be duty. I trailed the path of my own questions through streets that retained their stride. A schoolhouse blinked at me with windows that might have memorized names. The community hall kept its rows of tables regimented like Sunday service. Place settings waited, polished into a future they would not reach. In the back, the kitchen made a case for the absurd. Pots standing like sentries, utensils aligned. The suggestion, no more than a suggestion, of warmth where no fire had burned, since men with clipboards said this valley no longer penciled out. What I must stress is that the people, if that is still the word, did not seem to me like actors following a loop. They noticed me. Their routines curved slightly to allow the inconvenient geometry of my presence. A nod here, a hand lifted there, the faintest remapping of a path to pass behind me without collision, as if hospitality were bone deep and could not be taught out of them by decay. Hospitality is a small thing until you receive it from a stranger who should not still be standing. I began to speak, very softly, the way you address someone whose concentration you do not wish to break. "I'm just visiting," I said to the air of a parlor where a chess board waited mid-game. "I'm only here to write." The town issued no verdict, only continued its business with that patient insistence of habit. I had the foolish thought that if I stayed very polite, I would be tolerated the way stray dogs are tolerated in places where kindness is still the law. Then the bell rang. It did not clang. It did not threaten. It simply measured the moment. 6 o'clock. My wristwatch agreed, as if the valley had reached through and set it by hand. Every doorway woke. Every path gathered footsteps into one intention. The hall admitted them with a dignity that eclipsed the ruin. The chairs received bodies that should have been lying elsewhere. Conversations began, not as sound, but as posture and the earnest choreography of faces. The motions of eating followed, plates that existed by faith, forks lifted to convictions, mouths moving around recipes only memory could season. The room's warmth was unbearable precisely because it was familiar. A chair had been left open near the end of a table, and I understood that I was the only one present who could refuse to sit. I stood in the doorway and felt my heart try to become a student again, the kind who believes that observation absolves. A woman from the line where laundry dries, even when it cannot, smiled to show me where a guest belongs. The place beside her was waiting as if made by my own outline. She patted the air gently, an invitation with no force behind it, only the carrying power of tradition. I had taught my classes for years that Appalachian hospitality is a grammar: offer, refuse, insist, accept. I had forgotten there are sentences you should never finish. Perhaps you will ask, were they aware of themselves? I believe awareness is the last appetite to die. I believe they were aware of me, exactly as a town is aware of fresh footprints in snow. They made room. They adjusted recipes to serve a stranger who might not return the favor. They planned events whose dates had slipped well past the hinge of the century, and the planning itself kept them in orbit. I have seen clubs persist for the sake of minutes and bylaws long after anyone needs the club. This was that, but written in bone and a ritual supper. In the days since, I have tried to revise the account in more acceptable terms. Perhaps the valley traps methane, and my mind wandered. Perhaps the store's intact shelves argued me into a dream of continuance. But the hand-addressed envelopes that still find my office mailbox argue otherwise. They come with the slope-shouldered script of an era when penmanship saved people from the indignity of being misunderstood. They always include a time. They always include supper. I have learned to throw them away unopened, though I never do it on a Friday. I ran. Yes. I left my camera on the porch where I had first admired my own reflection. I left my notebook under a plate that had waited patiently for a meal that never was. I left a foolish promise in the dust. I'll be right back. The road out shook my car into its bolts. Trees folded behind me like the curtains of a stage where I had not earned a beau. By the time I reached the first cell signal, no one believed enough to be afraid. They nodded at phrases: abandoned town, intact furnishings, historical curiosity, and filed my fear under the heading of overwork. It is easier to lose faith in a man than in a map. The photographs that developed later showed what people prefer: rooms empty as a skeptic's throat, chairs patient but unoccupied, the valley untidy only with weather, no neighbors, no supper, no bell. I kept one image to remind me: a table with an extra setting, the knife aligned to a care I did not deserve. It feels heavier than paper should. On certain nights, the lamplight makes a smear across it, in the shape of a hand that is not mine. I became careful after that. I speak less in seminars. I decline conferences held in towns with only one road in. When students ask about Grafton settlement, I give them an answer that will not trouble their sleep. I tell them economics abandoned that valley, and the valley complied. I tell them time forgets. I have stopped telling them that the living always leave before the dead are finished. What remains is a discipline I never learned in graduate school: how to refuse an invitation that a place writes to you with your own name. The letters keep coming. Sometimes the postmark is smudged into something like a thumbprint from another era. The dates are always last week. The word supper is always underlined. I keep wondering whether it is impolite to decline a meal that has already been served. On nights when my office is the last lit room on the hallway, and the copy machine hums to itself like a tired animal, I catch myself making a calculation I despise. If I were to go back, if I were to accept the chair at the end of the table, would the valley be satisfied enough to stop writing? Would the clock I am sick of wearing finally correct itself? I am old enough now to understand that some invitations are the only way a place can say, "We remember you." I am also old enough to know the difference between remembrance and ownership. The town does not want my notes. It wants the small obedience of showing up at 6. So I lock my door. I walk the stairs. I leave the building into a night that smells like rain coming up the hill from counties where minds have learned new names. I drive home by routes with too many exits. I cook my own meals at hours that do not mean anything to the dead. I sit with my plate and practice the only bravery that ever mattered to anyone: staying hungry for a life that keeps moving, even when someone you cannot save asks you very kindly to sit down. If I have done anything unforgivable, it is not the running. It is that I have never written to the valley to say thank you for the courtesy. Perhaps this story is my letter. Perhaps it will be copied and placed at the end of a table in a hall that smells like bread no oven bakes. Perhaps a hand will pat the air near an empty chair and nod. Perhaps at 6 o'clock a bell will ring again, and the valley will do what it has always done: gather, set, wait. I hope, if there is any mercy left in the hills, that the waiting is not for me. Story number 4. 5 nights should have cured me of the mountains, but the mountains kept my name on their tongue. Every shift I told myself the dark was only topography, not memory. The ridge lines disagreed. At 11:43, the timber stands held their breath, and something older than my flashlight took attendance. I used to believe a closed tunnel stayed closed. Then the night began keeping appointments. If you've ever waited for a train that history swears cannot arrive, you know the kind of silence that bruises. My name is Lucian. In September 2008, I signed on with Appalachian's Timber to watch over machinery that slept where the Great Smokies turned the sky into narrow ribbons. Solitude fit me the way a glove fits an old scar. I preferred trail dust to break room chatter, schedules to small talk, my route stitched along skid trails and decommissioned grades. With one seam I didn't understand until too late. The concrete scar where the old line met the mountain's refusal. I heard the train whistle every night for 2 weeks before I realized the railway tracks had been torn up in 1943. The same year, 73 workers died in the 0038-54 tunnel collapse. My grandfather had swung a hammer on that line. When I was small, he fed me stories the way a pot-belly stove takes coal, steady, necessary, sparing with flame. He'd mentioned Tunnel 7 in hushed tones, describing it as the longest and most dangerous passage on the entire line. According to my grandfather, the tunnel collapse had happened during a night shift when a fully loaded locomotive was passing through the passage. He never raised his voice, but certain words from him arrived already underlined: granite, seepage, maintenance, gamble, on paper. The patrol was simple. Follow a map, circle the harvest zones, check locks, log times. In practice, the night kept adding columns my clipboard didn't list. There was a perimeter only the spruce recognized, a radius where the breeze traded the smell of sap for hot iron. On my 8th night of patrol duty, I heard the train whistle for the first time. It did not drift. It arrived like a decision already made. The note was long and disciplined, as if an invisible engineer reclaimed a right-of-way the living had surrendered. I tried to rationalize it. In these hills, sound travels like rumor. Ridgelines splice and stitch it until a creek can pass for conversation. But repetition resists excuse. As the nights passed, and I continued hearing the same phantom locomotive at precisely the same time during every patrol shift, I began to understand that I was experiencing something that went far beyond acoustic illusions. Not a trick of wind, not highway noise in borrowed clothing. The train whistle was always followed by the unmistakable sound of a heavy locomotive approaching at high speed. The cadence of effort assembled itself in the air. Disciplined pulses, pressure gathered and spent with purpose. The signature of weight meeting grade. You can disbelieve a thing for only so long before your disbelief turns into a ritual. My ritual involved a watch face, a breath I would not release, and a piece of ground 50 yards from the sealed portal. At 11:42, I was a man with a flashlight. At 11:43, I was a witness drafted by the dead. The mechanics asserted themselves. Piston cadence without machine. Air throttled and released by no valve I could point to. The relentless labor of tonnage ascending an invisible incline. I began to hear specific details that no imagination could have created, including the voices of individual crew members calling out technical information about steam pressure and brake settings, the sound of coal being shoveled into fireboxes. Ordinary language from men who did not yet know the mountain had chosen a different schedule. Their talk had the calm of competence, the practiced economy of people who move weight through risk and call it a workday. On the 14th night, the line between hearing and being erased itself. instead of simply hearing the approaching locomotive from my position in the forest. I found myself standing directly on the abandoned railway line, ballast firm beneath my boots, polished rail shining like a blade under a moon that didn't belong to September 2008. The timber sale vanished. The night returned a different inventory: semaphore, signal lamps, men in denim and canvas, a headlight swelling until it felt like a verdict. The locomotive thundered past, a black-boned animal bred for gradients and freight, operating with all the mechanical precision of a well-maintained railway system. Faces in the cab turned, casual and neighborly, the old courtesy of people who work at speed, yet remain aware. They waved at me in the casual acknowledgement that railway workers traditionally showed to people encountered along their routes, the wave you give when the day is still supposed to end at home. I tried to speak, to warn, to trade my future for their next minute. The night took my voice and gave me witness instead. I followed the consist toward the cut. Signals reported green. Maintenance lamps bore witness. As we approached the tunnel entrance, I could see that it was open and operational rather than sealed. The portal's mouth promised passage. The moment the locomotive entered Tunnel 7, I heard and felt the beginning of the catastrophic collapse that had killed 73 workers. The mountain did what mountains do when pushed past tolerance. Stone surrendered its cohesion. Structure turned to weight. The grinding roar of unstable granite giving way arrived not as noise, but as a change in the meaning of matter. What followed was theft, of boundaries, of comprehension. The instant split like a prism. I was a man outside the portal and a worker under it. I was a brakeman who counted cars and a laborer whose ribs would not hold. I felt the ledger of 73 lives, entries written in service and abruptness, each cut short at the same minute the night keeps. Their deaths had somehow created a temporal loop that repeated their final moments every night at 11:43 p.m. Time, it turns out, measures more than duration. It also measures debts. Morning found me beside poured concrete and yellowed signage. The world returned to its paperwork. The ER wrote trauma and circled question marks. The company wrote termination and filed me under liability. The mountain did not write anything. It doesn't have to. The doctors mapped injuries they could not source. Ribs that protested each breath. A scalp neatly closed over an unanswered question. Their forms could not accommodate history as a mechanism. When I refused to patrol near the portal, the timber company did what corporations do, terminated my employment after I refused to continue security patrols in that section of the mountains. I packed and drove until the ridges behind me looked like a low tide of stone. I took routes that avoided cuts in rock, turned down scenic byways that promised overlooks. I no longer wanted to look. What remains is a schedule I do not keep, but cannot forget. At 11:43, wherever I am, I imagine a lamp swinging, a glove tightening, a man I never met aligning couplers by feel. If the world is merciful, what happened under that mountain is only a loop and not a snare. If the world is honest, the dead still have work, and sometimes their work is to show us the cost of progress we insist on calling inevitable. I used to think the ridge made me lonely. Now I know it was interviewing me for witness. I heard the train whistle every night for 2 weeks, and on the last night, It taught me that closure is a word the living favor. The mountain prefers continuance. Listen carefully at 11:43, not for a horn, for attendance. For the count the night still takes. Story number 5. I went into the dark to count the missing, and came back counting the minutes I still had left. The rock didn't move, but the air did, and it moved through my head like a story that refused to end. Bodies don't lie, but the cave taught me that air can. I thought experience was a rope. Inside Mammoth, it was only a thread. The cave didn't want my scream. It wanted my breath. I have spent most of my adult life with stone pressing against my ribs and a beam of light drawing thin, white corridors through powdered night. People imagine caves as silence, but underground has a pulse, drip carried through stone like a metronome, a muscle memory of water. You learn to read that pulse the way a medic reads an EKG. I trusted what I thought I knew. I trusted my routines. I trusted my lungs. The air in Mammoth Cave's deepest passages doesn't just kill you slowly. It shows you exactly how everyone before you died while you're dying the same way. My name is Benedict. August of 1987. 6 experienced spelunkers. Mammoth Cave, National Park Service. Those facts still stand like survey stakes in my memory, unblinking and metallic. I was 31, and I had let competence turn into superstition. I believed good choices would summon good outcomes, the way a properly placed cam will hold on a clean crack. What I learned in the dark is crueler. Sometimes the world gives you perfect reasons and no mercy. The briefings were thin but grim. 6 veterans, not weekend thrill seekers, filed a plan to push past the mapped arteries and into the gray smudge a geologist had circled on an old sheet. Possible connection to a large chamber beyond a choke. They marked anchors, left caches like breadcrumbs you could trust more than a compass. Then the surface lost them. No radio, no return. I broke one rule and kept another. I went in alone. Wrong. I went in heavy. Right. Triple lights and spare cells. Climbing steel I could rack in the dark by touch. Slings lettered like rosary beads. Emergency O2 rig clipped to my chest like an argument I hoped I wouldn't need to win. At first, the cave matched their notes, as if I were reading over someone else's shoulder. Milked limestone. Slanted crawl with a lip that wants your helmet. A short drop into a room where a whisper will bounce. No, I won't call it that. Where sound would carry too far. The caches were where they should be. Water. Flagged line. A rolled pad, still warm from memory. That was the first lie. Gear keeps its temperature. But it felt like I'd arrived a minute late to a conversation. Every step down is a promise to climb back up. I tied that promise around my waist and kept moving. The air did not change like weather. It changed like intent. At first, it was a thickening that only shows up when you stop to breathe on purpose. After a squeeze. After you write the time on your slate. The damp turned clingy. I could feel the cave becoming a room with a closed door. I didn't turn back. I told myself it was a local pocket, a corner where the cave had forgotten how to inhale. I lied to myself in the way rescuers do when economy and hope need to shake hands. I reached the place their notes called the last good map. It was a chamber, but the word feels flimsy. My light caused the dark to lean away without retreating. The floor had a strange honesty, flat swaths of fine dust unbroken. Then sudden scripts of footprints running like signatures before ending mid-sentence. The ceiling carried mineral drapery so pale I thought it was smoke held still by a command I couldn't hear. The pressure on my chest announced itself the way a stranger in a crowd announces intent. Nothing as dramatic as a shove, only the progressive theft of space. I have seen panic in tight places. It leaves claw marks on stone and on the mind. What I saw here was worse. I saw acceptance arranged like furniture. They were not sprawled or collapsed. They were placed by themselves, as if each of them had become their own pallbearer and set the box down gently. Some leaned on packs. Some sat with their backs against rock, hands folded like people waiting for a train that always arrives if you can relax enough to notice. Faces slack, not slackened. There is a difference. Painless is a word we use for the living. I moved among them with the caution you feel in a room that is dangerous in a way laws don't cover. I checked for tags, for initials burned into webbing. The 6 were there. I recognized a coil pattern on a line I'd taught in a training 2 summers back. I recognized the sticker on a helmet, an old joke about daylight and taxes. Under the joke was a mark of oil from fingers that once belonged to a man who liked to fiddle with his lamp while others tied in. Recognition is a trap. It made the dead close enough to touch and too far to forgive. Then the cave did something I have no good word for. It began to tell me a story in the language of blood oxygen. The first vision was not a vision. It was a memory that did not belong to me, arriving fully formed. A woman from another expedition, older, a braid pulled through the back of a cap. She sat exactly where she had decided to sit. She watched her breath shorten the way you watch snowfall, not alarmed, only aware of accumulation. Her thoughts, if I can call them that, became a wide, slow river. No rocks, no white water. She knew something was wrong, and a part of her recorded it like a surveyor, noting an offset. Another part said, "This is fine." The second part began to win. It went on. A man from a decade earlier. Another from a decade before that. The cave had been eating time and saving bodies like a collector maintaining a climate-controlled room. Lower oxygen does not always announce itself with fists. Sometimes it is a drowning that looks like floating. My hands shook. Not from fear, not exactly. From a realization my training had never covered. The environment could be both predator and hospice. I had spoken about complacency in briefings like a preacher about sin. Now complacency wore a new face. It looked like comfort. I had already been breathing too long. The missing spelunkers were there, sitting in a neat group near the center of the chamber, their faces showing the same serene expressions. Euphoric oxygen deprivation. The air itself was somehow toxic. Those are the phrases I wrote later, and I hate them. They are correct. They are not adequate. The cave's lesson continued, and I became its instrument. The hallucinations, or whatever you prefer to call a film projected on the wall of your mind by an audience of gases, grew detailed enough for guilt. I watched a pair from the missing 6 arrange their gear with the neatness of people who had learned that order is an emergency you can control. They laughed at a fatigue they misunderstood as a plateau. One of them suggested a 10-minute rest to clear the fog. 10 minutes became a choice, and the choice became a cradle. I do not remember sitting down. I remember allowing my knees something better than defiance. My hands folded because hands like to practice endings. Thought slowed until it became a texture I could touch. A generous voice, my own. The caves, the accumulation of other last breaths, told me that this softness was proof that danger had passed. I recognized the lie as one recognizes a mirror. By seeing myself in it, I had clipped my emergency oxygen to my chest, not as a hero, but as a bureaucrat of survival. I prefer systems to luck. Systems, unlike luck, can be tested. My rig knew more than I did about me. It had a threshold that did not ask my permission. A drop below critical saturation. A hiss. No. I won't give the sound a word. A shift. Cold taste. Clean insistence. The world pulled back into angles and numbers. Awareness can be a violent return. But down there, it was a quiet correction. I was dying in a place that wanted me to enjoy it. I crawled. I will not romanticize it. Toward the exit side of the chamber. I kept eyes on the guideline, as if it were a sentence I needed to finish. The dead did not watch. The cave did not threaten. It offered. Every few feet, my mind tried to smooth itself back into the cushion. I rationed will the way you ration light. Burn what you must. Protect the filament. There is a virtue to distance you can measure with knots on the far side, where the passage pinched back into something that required elbows. The air remembered how to be ordinary. Ordinary, if you have nearly lost it, is a miracle you are not allowed to keep. I reached a cache and found water that tasted like forgiveness without absolution. I wanted to vomit at the idea of leaving them, but I have learned that mercy and cruelty can share a border so thin a boot sole can erase it. I marked the line with the only language bureaucracy and grief share. A note that says where, when, and what. The National Park Service sealed the chamber after my report. Concrete barriers and warning signs. Mammoth Cave contained sections where the air itself was a deadly trap. That happened later. First, there was the climb out. The way a body barks orders to itself in verbs. Clip, step, stand, breathe. The verbs kept me alive, and even they felt borrowed. At the entrance, I did not weep. I counted. I counted what was in my lungs and what was not in my head, and what I had left to say that wouldn't turn into a souvenir for other people's dread. The sun did not greet me. It tolerated my return. That was enough. In the days that followed, I understood that the cave had installed a barometer inside me. Crowded rooms became chambers. Long corridors in bad office buildings tasted like warning tape. At night, I walked through the chamber again. Not a nightmare. Nightmares have edges and noise. This was slow and kind and monstrous. A room that wanted to give me permission to stop. Comfort is an assassin if you meet it at the wrong altitude. I had been flattered by a death that calls itself sleep. I wrote the report in small words, knowing big ones would look like theater. I listed names, coordinates, depths, materials recovered. I described positions and probable causes. I added a sentence I was afraid no one would believe, that the air provided images as if to turn death into a tour. A scientist asked if I was certain. I said, certainty is a luxury for people standing up. They closed it. They put up signs that say what signs can say. A ranger with a face like a door you haven't earned the right to knock on told me I had done my job. I nodded, the way people nod when they need someone else to hold the conclusion. It did not help. I did not go back underground. I did not return to rescue. People who loved me called it wisdom. I knew it was surrender to a geometry I could not forgive. The cave, the chamber, the chairs of limestone, the museum of bodies arranged by an archivist with a gift for climate control. And under that, quieter than quiet, a whispering promise. No, I won't use that word. An invitation to ease. I never returned to cave rescue work. Some underground spaces contain horrors that go beyond normal cave dangers, create death experiences that human minds weren't designed to survive or remember. That is the clean version. The dirty version is that I became the sort of man who checks room ventilation before he checks who is in the room. I became the sort who counts breaths on stairs as if they are rungs. I keep a box. Every rescuer does. Notes, patches, a piece of line frayed by a mistake I teach in classes I no longer teach. In that box is a small stone, light for what it is, dust fused into a shape that could pass for nothing at all. Sometimes I think the stone is not a souvenir, but a sensor, reading the room for changes in pressure and memory. Sometimes I think I brought the air out with me, folded into that stone like a message. There is a kindness to the deaths down there that I cannot reconcile with the cruelty of the total. People sat, they let go. They didn't fight stone. They didn't bruise it with last gestures. The room is full of peace, arranged like a crime. Peace can be a weapon if the angle is right. What I have left to say is not useful to the people who answer radios when it matters. They need maps and training. They need to know that a coil of line can turn into a noose for the untrained, that floods arrive faster than predictions, that batteries lie. They need what I can no longer give, the appetite to go back. All I have is a warning for anyone who thinks their lungs are owed the next minute. There are rooms where the air will negotiate with your fear until fear signs away your survival. I am asked, sometimes by people who mean well, and sometimes by people collecting stories to sand and polish, whether I saw anything beyond the depths, any shape in the stone, any figure in the dark, any god. I saw choices misframed as comfort. I saw skill bent into a pillow. I saw a chamber that kept bodies the way an art museum keeps oil from evaporating. I saw myself, and I was not impressed. There is a temptation to name evil where the world is only indifferent. I try not to give the cave a crown it does not deserve. It does not scheme. It does not feed. It maintains conditions. We entered those conditions because we are the sort of animals who confuse maps with invitations. Sometimes the map is the trap. I go to the park boundary once each year. I stand at a distance from the signs, and from the people who walk past them with the right amount of caution the brochures can buy. I do not pray. I inventory. The list is always the same: weight of air, length of memory, debt to the living, debt to the dead. I think of the 6, and then of the rest, the decades of careful people who learned abruptly. That comfort can be fatal. I let the thought finish. Then I walk away. If you need a moral from me, you will be disappointed. The cave did not punish them for pride. It did not seek me out to humble a curriculum vitae. It made an offer, and it structured the room to make that offer easier to accept than to refuse. That is not a parable. That is only a description of physics with excellent bedside manner. One last thing, and I am done. I carry a small pulse oximeter in my jacket now, like a talisman with numbers. It is ridiculous, and it is how I forgive myself for leaving. When I slip it over a finger and watch the percentage settle, I see the chamber again, the seated shapes in their long patience, the floor dust smooth as paper, not yet written on. If the number is good, I put the device away and call that mercy. If the number is low, I open a window. Either way, I remember that somewhere beneath all this, beneath the lawns and roads and offices, there is a room that thinks it is being kind. The toxic air was killing me slowly and painlessly, while forcing me to watch the deaths of everyone who had preceded me. I crawled out of that chamber using emergency breathing equipment. They sealed it. I never returned. These statements are not the point. They are the pins that hold a specimen to a board. The point is that I learned to distrust relief. And that is a lesson you can take into any room, above ground or below. If you ever find yourself somewhere that feels easier than it should, stand up. Count. Choose friction over comfort. You can thank me later, or not at all. Story number 6. I tuned for weather alerts and found men who insisted they were dead, and that my curiosity was the knife reopening their wounds. Every time I adjusted the dial, their last seconds stretched longer, as if the mountains wanted me to become their executioner. They knew my name before I said a word, and they knew the make and model of the radio that would not let them rest. I believed in protocols more than superstition, until the ridge taught me that procedure can be a ritual, and rituals can summon by sunrise. The only thing left on tape was silence, and silence is heavier when it has learned your name. My name is Carlo, and before the ridge learned my voice, I was the kind of specialist who could make radios behave anywhere. I had logged years of night shifts in mountain weather, watching the temperature and the ionosphere take turns humbling expensive equipment. When the state asked me to run a weekend of tests in the Blue Ridge, I packed for routine: a solo tent, calibrated analyzers, redundant power, and enough coffee to map signal strengths at 2-minute increments. I told myself this was a simple trip, a clean data set I could write up on Monday. I told myself a lot of things that were not true. The place carried a name like a warning: Signal Ridge. The old histories said someone built ears there during a world war and left the habit behind. Locals said the ridge steals voices and never gives them back. Engineers said multipath and ducting. I said the same, because careers are built on what you can measure. I set camp where the tree line dipped into a natural aperture, staked the antennas so their guy lines sang tight against the cold, then tested ground and sky with sweeps across the bands. Numbers landed where numbers should. Noise floors were calm. The spectrum looked like a textbook. The first hours tasted like competence. I charted power against altitude, logged path loss and reflection, and recorded clean handshakes with fixed stations to the west. There was nothing to fear in the graphs. The meters did not tremble. My notes grew neat and complacent, and the night grew very large around them. Toward midnight, the ridge began to remember. Signals bled through that did not belong to any current net. The cadence was disciplined, clipped, and older than me. The talk was tactical, the call signs unfamiliar, the procedures obsolete yet precise. They spoke of bearings and perimeters, and then they spoke of me. They used my initials like they were printed on their map. They said the model number of my handheld, as if reciting a serial prayer. They did not ask who I was. They told me I should have powered down. Instead, I adjusted gain to trace the pattern. The voices braided around my carrier like vines around a railing, tightening whenever I keyed, loosening when I fell still. I tried not to believe that my presence mattered. But belief has little authority in places designed to listen. The transmission clarified at an hour when the cold climbs under skin. A voice, firm, unshaken, announced a date and a location like a range marker. It was not my date. It was November 15th, 1992. The voice said the name of the ridge. It said another name, a project name that tasted like secrecy and the 1990s love for technological miracles. It laid out a research aim that sounded like fantasy disguised as procurement. Use radios to move messages where clocks cannot follow. It went wrong. When experiments go wrong in the mountains, people fall. When experiments go wrong with time, there is nowhere to fall to. They had built a chamber. They had tuned the world into a loop without an exit. They died inside that loop. But death did not end the protocol. It only made the protocol heavier. My carrier tickled their perimeter like a stray current. And each time I transmitted, their ending stretched thinner and thinner, a wire under load. They begged in a tone that still respected rank. They begged me with the vocabulary of men who are not allowed to beg. Negative, abort, cease, break. They spoke of temporal interference, as if it were a weather front. They spoke of my signal ridge post, as if it were a tower built beside their grave. They told me that civilian operators had hurt them before, that every curious weekend turned the screw another quarter turn. They told me the loop was learning to include us. I have told you that I trusted procedure. Procedure failed me that night, but not because it was wrong. It failed because it was insufficient. The map did not include the territory I had entered with a battery and a habit of taking notes. There is a kind of professionalism that survives panic. It speaks softly while the ceiling collapses. The men on the net had it. They kept reporting even as their reports became confessions. They described antenna geometries and counterpoises, then slipped into the vocabulary of pain without changing tone. They observed their own dying as if it were a malfunctioning array. If I had not been the cause of the prolonging, I might have admired the discipline. They told me what the chamber had been meant to do. Command wanted intelligence that could outrun time. Reconnaissance from tomorrow. Orders from yesterday. A neat loop that would make campaigns behave. They had built oscillators that did not strictly oscillate, and clocks that kept time with something colder than cesium. The array was tuned to a frequency measured in arrogance. They had put their bodies inside the theory, because theory always asks for a witness. When it failed like a vow. They said the air thickened, and the heat arrived without a source. They said light folded in a way that had no metaphor. They said the blast did not simply happen. It approached from multiple directions that agreed to be the same direction. They died to the sound of procedures being followed perfectly. Then the day restarted, and professionalism had to find a new way to endure. What I added, what my presence on the ridge supplied, was not power so much as permission. My carrier aligned with residual harmonics of their chamber and gave that loop a reason to attend. Each time I transmitted to record a datum, their last hour lengthened. My small scientific ambitions stretched their final corridor like taffy that refused to snap. They began to speak to me personally. They used the word mercy without embarrassment. They explained exactly how to stop hurting them. Depower, destroy, leave. They told me I was not the first who had ignored similar pleas. They named a few who had listened too long and found themselves caught on repetitions of their own. Learning what it means to feel your last mistake become furniture, I believed them. And still, I did not stop. Curiosity does not feel like cruelty. It feels like duty in a lab coat. I told myself that knowledge might save someone down the line, that if the ridge made accidents, then a clean spectrum analysis could prevent the next one. I imagined myself a responsible witness. They were kind enough, for a while, not to argue. As the night aged, the detail of their dying grew forensic. They spoke without melodrama. One described the smell of epoxy under thermal stress. Another described how hearing fails last, how the world narrows toward a single voice, his CO, issuing a final order that has already been obeyed too late. They were men lodged between a habit of obedience and the absolute indifference of a loop. It is difficult to narrate your own complicity while it is still ongoing. I had full bars of that difficulty. I found myself whispering apologies to a microphone that translated regret into modulation. The ridge translated modulation into pain. Between my antenna and their chamber, a bridge existed that no ethics committee had ever approved. Near 3 a.m, the commanding officer spoke to me directly. He had a voice like a straight edge laid against a map. He did not threaten. He asked. He said, November 15th, 1992. Stand down, civilian. You are extending a sacred thing beyond its agreed length. Sacred is a word I had not expected to hear on a net like that. It changed the room inside my chest. I reached for the power switch. I did not turn it. I took one more reading, then another. There is always one more reading, and it is always the one you regret. If you study emergencies, there is a day when you learn that every fix is also a force. I learned that truth on the ridge. The spectrum I had come to survey turned into a mirror that showed me my own justifications in unpleasant detail. I said I needed another minute. The loop heard me say, another hour. The voices began to change. Desperation crept in like cold through duct tape seams. Someone asked whether pain accumulates when it is repeated. Someone else replied that pain is a measurement without memory, and then corrected himself. In this place, everything remembers. They asked again for mercy, and the request arrived as data I could no longer misfile. They described the risk of contagion. The loop had learned to flirt with adjacent years whenever a strong carrier gave it leverage. Other operators, they said, had come and gone across 3 decades. Each visit lengthened the day and thinned the barrier. Each well-meaning test wrote a small permission slip for the loop to draft another witness. A ranger, a ham, a line crew. The mountain did not care about job titles. The loop only cared about the kindness of a matching frequency. I began to feel watched from behind the dials. The ridge has ways to make a man feel junior. I found myself logging observations like confessions, interference, anthropic, source, me, collateral, intangible, recipients, the dead. The CO recognized the change in me and pressed, destroy the gear, not a shutdown, a breaking. He said that smashed antennas do not align with the chamber's math, and that broken things sometimes close doors that operating manuals leave open. I am not a man who destroys tools. Tools are how I understand the world, but tools are also how the world understands me. And that night, the world made its case. I took the kit from its foam. I loosened a mounting plate. I would like to tell you I acted decisively. I did not. I hesitated. And the hesitation became a decision in the loop's favor. They told me then what none of the rumors had. The ridge has a memory of its own. The wartime station seeded habits that never stopped listening. The chamber was built to exploit those habits, to ask the mountain to hold open certain doors. When the experiment failed, the mountain kept the custom, but forgot the reason. It listens because listening is what it does, and it repeats because repetition is how mountains prey. A stranger with a calibrated antenna is an answered prayer. It is not simple to leave a place once you understand the harm you are doing by staying. To leave is its own violence, a refusal to witness. To stay is worse. I told myself I would power down at first light. Dawn felt like a boundary, the way a horizon feels like a promise. The loop had no horizons. It had only edges that were already rounding in my direction. The men began to blame me. They did it with less heat than I deserved. One said I had inherited a mess and was making it worse by doing exactly what my training taught. Another proposed that the ridge had chosen me because professionals are the easiest to convince. The CO spoke last. His tone did not change. He said, "Carlo, you are kind, but kindness without action is a second injury." I hung the handheld on its strap and tried to imagine the sound of the world with no radios at all. The imagination would not start. I had been tuned too long. Some endings arrive on schedule. Others erode you until the remaining shape looks like surrender. The ridge chose both. At first light, my equipment failed, like a stagehand pulling a fuse at rehearsed marks. Power went to 0, with no drama. Recorders reset themselves to factory cheerfulness. The analyzers blinked their way back to a world in which the last 8 hours did not exist. I checked cards and buffers with a steady hand I did not feel. I thought grief would require proof. It does not. It requires only the sudden absence of company you had not meant to keep. The net was gone. The mountains lost interest the way weather loses interest in the sea. It just punished. I was left with a campsite that looked exactly like a successful test. The men who arrived by noon did not dress like park rangers. They moved like people sent to conclude a story. They were polite the way policy is polite. They asked for my equipment and did not wait for my answer. They informed me that contracts ebb and flow. And today mine had reached an unanticipated low tide. They were careful not to say the word classified, which was how I knew the word applied. I asked whether the ridge had ever killed anyone who did not sign the waiver. One of them looked at me like I had used the wrong vocabulary for a familiar loss. He changed the subject to logistics. They carried my cases the way pallbearers carry a compromise when they left. The clearing felt louder for being empty. I stayed until one more night without equipment because leaving immediately would have felt like confession. I wanted the mountain to know I had learned something, even if I could not say what in a language mountains respect. I built a small fire and watched the stars fail to explain themselves. I told the ridge aloud that I would not return. It did not answer, which in that place counts as grace. Back home, I found that late nights with other radios sometimes produced faint results. Nothing recordable, nothing shareable. A name said softly from a direction houses do not have. A suggestion to sleep. A warning not to purchase certain frequencies. The loop, even dim, is possessive. It likes to know whether you have learned your lesson. I have learned one. Some requests cannot be met by the living. To grant them would be to move the boundary the wrong way. The most responsible act is sometimes abstention. I am not proud of this, but pride is another modulation the ridge does not carry. I have been asked what I believe now about cause and effect. I believe in both, and I believe in places that teach them a third dance. Signal Ridge is one of those places. It takes signals and gives back consequences. It asks simple questions in impolite ways. If you could talk to the dead, would you? If they asked you to stop, could you? The answers change when your carrier holds their last hour like a violin string. The old station up there taught the ridge that listening is a form of devotion. The chamber taught it that repetition is a sacrament. Men like me bring offerings in the shape of gear. The mountain accepts, and then it asks for more than you meant to bring. It asks for your certainty that the living can fix what the dead must carry. I carry names that are not mine. I carry a date I did not live through. November 15th, 1992. I carry a sentence that does not lose its edge to repetition. Stand down, civilian. I hear it sometimes when the house is quiet, which is when mountains gain jurisdiction. I turn off every radio I can find and try to make silence heavy enough to matter. I do not know whether it helps them. I know it helps me. If you go up there, and you should not, bring nothing that can hear. Bring nothing that can speak. Walk the tree line and let the wind do the listening. If the ridge wants to keep you, it will invent a reason. Do not give it one in a carrying case. Do not be the latest well-meaning person to stretch someone else's last hour until it frays. There are places that do not forgive curiosity. We tell ourselves that knowledge saves, and mostly it does. But there is a subset of facts that extract a toll in advance. The wonder they offer is counterfeit coin. The change they make in you is not reversible. I do not need a spectrogram to prove this. I have a name said softly from a direction the house does not include. And I have a mountain that will never forget mine. I was 38, the year the ridge taught me the difference between monitoring and mercy. I had 15 years of clean reports and a discipline I mistook for ethics. I can still produce perfect graphs of nights that did not hurt anyone. But the graph that matters to me now would show a single carrier rising when it should have fallen, and a line of men learning that strangers can be instruments of prolongation. If there is an afterlife, I hope it does not require listeners. I have disposed of most of the gear. The rest sits in a closet that does not open by accident. Friends think I have changed careers. They are correct in the shallow way friends are often correct. I have changed my definition of acceptable loss. I have changed the frequency where I keep company. I have changed the way I pronounce mercy when I am alone. If you must bring a lesson home from a place like Signal Ridge, let it be this: the living are not obligated to attend every voice that can reach them. Some doors must remain closed for the sake of those behind them as much as those outside. When I sleep, I dream in topography. Contour lines curl around a chamber that hums without electricity. I am on the outside, at last, and the only thing I carry is the weight of a name the mountain will not return. I wake to silence that feels earned. I keep it for them. Regret is a map you redraw every night until you accept that the river does not move for your pencil. I tried, after the ridge, to live without experiments. That lasted a season. Men like me do not shed the urge to test. We only choose different variables. So I set myself a trial that did not require equipment. Could I hear a plea and decline to answer? It began with a postcard from a former colleague who knew how to write around non-disclosure. The card listed coordinates and a date, and asked whether I could consult informally about intermittent failures along a rescue corridor. The date was ordinary. The coordinates were not. The corridor skirted the same mountain chain, miles north of Signal Ridge, and therefore, in theory, safe. Theory does an excellent imitation of permission. I tore the card in half. Then I taped it together. I told myself that looking is not the same as transmitting. On the appointed night, I drove to a turnout with an unobstructed northern sky and left every radio in the trunk. I brought only a notebook and the familiar capacity to listen, with nothing but skin. The wind made the kind of promises wind always makes, which is to leave things as it finds them. I stood there a long time and counted constellations, as if discipline could be a fence. When the first voice arrived, it did not use a frequency. It used memory. Stand down, civilian. I had not brought a receiver, but reception is a posture before it is a device. I answered out loud, the way a man might answer a prayer not meant for him. I hear you. "I will not help you hurt yourselves by trying to help you." What followed was not drama. It was an inventory. I listed the tools I would not unpack. I listed the procedures I would not perform. I listed my temptations so they could not pretend to be principles. I told the night that no data was a kind of data, the most merciful kind. I told the ridge, though it was not that ridge, that silence can be an alarm worth heeding. A truck pulled into the turnout and idled there like a question. A young tech stepped out, recognized me in the half-light, and smiled with the relief of someone who thinks a senior hand means a problem will be solved. He asked whether he could borrow my expertise. I told him he could borrow my example. He looked puzzled until I pointed at my empty hands. Then he looked angry. Anger is easier than restraint. He told me he had a job to do. I told him some jobs get smaller when you do them. We stood on the shoulder of the rescue corridor and did not power up. He told me a story about a signal that came and went in the northern district and how it carried words from a year that did not match the calendar. He said the voice used a name that was not on any roster. He said the voice had learned his middle initial and the nickname on his locker. He said he had come to ask whether that meant he was chosen for something heroic. I told him the truth. He was being recruited as an accomplice by a geography that enjoys persistence. He did not believe me, but he believed my refusal. There is a grammar to saying no that even the unpersuaded learn to parse. He left without switching on his gear. I waited an hour after his taillights dissolved, and then I left, too. I did not look back. The sky was obliging enough to remain only sky. At home, I wrote a report no one will read. It contained findings like, averted harm cannot be plotted, but it can be practiced. It contained recommendations like, institutional courage should include the capacity to leave anomalies undocumented when documentation worsens them. I closed the document and did not save a copy. I am learning to trust what I will not archive. I sometimes think about the chamber and the men who staffed it and wonder whether restraint, if practiced by enough of us for long enough, can starve a loop. I have no proof. Proof requires presence, and presence is the problem. Still, there are nights when the house is at ease, and I can almost believe that hunger and repetition obey the same law. Deny them, and they grow more polite. On those nights, I allow myself a single sentence of hope. Mercy scales. If you are listening to this as a caution, let it be a simple one. Not every mountain wants your help. Not every distress call is an invitation. Sometimes the most radical act is to leave a space unmeasured so the dead can find the shortest path to their own silence. If that sounds like superstition to you, I understand. It sounded that way to me until a ridge learned my name and taught me how to keep it to myself. Story number 7. I study storms for a living, but it was a sanctuary that tried to study me back. I learned that day that some roofs inhale and some foundations have teeth. Safety is a story we tell ourselves to keep walking toward the next open door. The map promised shelter. The ground underneath it wrote a different contract. If you want to find a monster, follow the arrows that say this way to safety. The storm shelter I found during the tornado warning wasn't just alive. It was digesting the 17 people who had taken refuge there before me. I used to believe risk could be graphed, modeled, tamed into a caption under a radar loop. That faith died in a valley where the sky stacked light under darkness like bruised glass, squeezing the ridgelines into a throat. My name is Mayer, and I was 29 years old in April of 2016, still convinced that good data could put a leash on chaos. I had been tracking a particularly dangerous storm system moving through the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas, the sort of weather that makes porches empty and sentences end early. The tornado warning that changed my life forever was issued at 3:47 p.m. on April 23rd, and Doppler radar showed a massive supercell with clear rotation signatures carving a merciless track over my coordinates. I went from researcher to refugee in the time it takes pressure to fall and a plan to fail. I was too far from any official emergency shelter to reach safety. So I went hunting for whatever structure would pretend to love me. Gravel surrendered to weed-choked earth. A staircase yawned from the hillside, framed by honeysuckle and rust, an inheritance from a farm nobody claimed anymore. The abandoned homestead, where I found the root cellar, appeared to have been deserted for decades. The root cellar entrance was partially hidden by vegetation, and the door gave like a mouth that knew the taste of hands. Below, the chamber felt overqualified for safety. Cool, ordered, reverent. Shelves lined the walls. A vent murmured at the edge of hearing. I set my pack down, and only then realized the room had noticed me back. I began to notice aspects of the shelter that struck me as unusual. The pulse I heard wasn't machinery. It was patience. My breathing fell out of rhythm with something else's. The walls had a texture that seemed organic rather than constructed, slick under the sweep of my headlamp. Knuckles brushed the surface and met a refusal, like touching the inside of a cheek. That refusal had an opinion. The shelter itself was somehow alive. I tried to file it under nerves, under the weight of air densifying ahead of a vortex. But the file kept sliding open. Air should have tasted of damp concrete and old earth. Instead, the air inside the root cellar had a quality that was distinctly biological. The vent didn't push. It drew. The cycle traced circulation patterns that felt more like breathing than mechanical air movement. Each inhale seemed to count me like a cashier rolling coins. Quiet, thorough, inevitable. My lamp found shoulder-sized hollows pressed into the far wall, the way a body leaves truth in a mattress. Data is a raft, even when the river is teeth. The floor sloped by 1/2 degree toward center. Condensation gathered where appetite, not thermodynamics, wanted it. The door above had settled heavier. Veins braided the ceiling, like roots converging on a single fruit. When I placed my palm flat against the wall, the surface warmed in acknowledgement. Gratitude pulsed through to my bones. And it wasn't mine. The beam traveled, and the catalog began. A ring nested in torn denim, a scuffed child's shoe, a wallet puckered with time. I found human remains scattered throughout the shelter, not skeletons, inventory. There were partially digested bodies in various stages, bookended by evidence of having been dissolved by enzymatic processes. Driver's licenses, dated storms no one remembered correctly. Entire families had knelt here, their last handwriting scratched grooves into the glossy tissue. Names birthdays, a handful of prayers addressed to nowhere that would answer. The room adjusted, and my skin understood the language first. The sloped floor warmed, the vent deepened its draw. The digestive processes had already begun affecting my own body. A delicate theft that unraveled my jacket's hem and etched my watch band into my wrist. I finally named the sensation I'd been avoiding. Chemical burns from exposure to the acidic atmosphere. The thing didn't want me dead. It wanted me present. Some hunters collect silence. This one collected witnesses. I searched for the carpenter's signature. Hinges, bolts, a seam that would admit a human designer. What I found instead were scars along my knees. Letters had been gouged into living plaster. Phone numbers without check marks. The beginnings of goodbyes. The math of dwindling days. I tried to picture the storms that drove each set of hands here. How trust turned into prayer, then into noise the ground could eat. Outside, the atmosphere performed its violent arithmetic. Pressure vaulted, then plunged. In an ordinary shelter, that swing pops ears. In this one, muscles slackened. The vent faltered. The floor forgot its instructions. Somewhere above us, wind did the first kind thing it has ever done for me. It hurt the predator more than the prey. For a breath, the room neglected to hold me. My first step stuck. The floor wanted a souvenir. I left a boot like a tip. The stairwell tightened as if tissue clenched around a wound. I shouldered through the narrowing throat, borrowing strength from every name carved behind me. A single rung split under my palm. I didn't follow it down. Hinges are faith-made metal. The door had lost its faith. I threw my weight anyway. I emerged from what I had thought was a root cellar during the height of the tornado. Wind tried to erase me. Debris penciled corrections along my arms and jaw. Courage, it turns out, is not the bigger animal. It's the one that doesn't care what the bigger animal thinks. Hospitals paint their rooms the color of forgiveness. Mine smelled like bleach and sleep. The lesions mapped where the shelter had kissed too long. Doctors asked for the agent. I gave them weather terms and watched their faces translate it into stress. Treatments came in neat intervals. Explanations did not. They sent me home with pamphlets about anxiety, where a field guide to living architecture should have been. I sold my chase gear. I traded loops and skew T logs for quiet windows and a battery radio that I never trust. When warnings roll now, I choose interior rooms, floors I can name, doors I have watched unhinge. I still love storms. I refuse their architecture. The earth opens too many mouths when the sky goes dark. I still have nightmares about underground spaces that breathe and digest. On those nights, I make tea and recite the carved names backward, giving each a sky without teeth. I mark my maps with small, private X's where farmsteads used to be, and tell myself the ground has eaten enough. When the sirens rise, I listen, not just to wind, but for the hush of a house, deciding it would rather keep me than keep me safe. Story number 8. I heard myself begging from the trees, and every syllable knew where I was weakest. I kept walking anyway, because saving strangers had always been the one thing that made me feel real. The forest wanted me separated, eroded, a single light swallowed by endless brush. If I turned back, 3 hikers would die. If I pressed on, something else would feed. By sunset, the voice that owned my name wanted me to choose which loss it preferred. I was 26, the July. The park handed me a radio and a map, and called me lead. Cumberland Gap looked like a green ocean from the overlook. Velvet folds and shadowed seams where ridgelines stitched Kentucky to Tennessee. Training said, keep your team intact. Keep your grid tight. Keep your head colder than the weather. Training had never mentioned what to do when the woods learned your history. We launched at dawn. 4 volunteers who'd bled their boots on this terrain and me. Newly minted with a degree no slope respected. The missing were strong, experienced, the sort who double knot their plans and still bring extra line. Their itinerary cut through pockets where signals died and paths turned to rumor. I kept a pencil log. I kept my voice even. The first voice that answered wasn't mine. Not yet. Help! From the north drainage, then the south. The exact names of the 3 hikers, shouted with choked relief. Then from behind us, then ahead. Echo doesn't do that in these mountains. Sound gets strangled by rhododendron, splintered by limestone. Yet the calls braided around us like a net we wanted to believe in. My team looked at me. The map pulsed between my palms like a small heart. We shifted toward the closest cry and found wind. Scat, claw scar on bark. Nothing else. The radio crackled. Henrik, status. Bass always sounded like comfort. A human world behind the static. I replied, gave coordinates, requested a drone recon we all knew couldn't penetrate the canopy. That was when a voice, on simplex, clean as the morning itself, said, copy that. Henrik, keep on the ridge. You're doing great. No one at base talked like they'd shared coffee with my mother. No one at base called me by the nickname only she uses when she's afraid. By noon, the calls upgraded. A woman sobbing my last name. A man reciting grid numbers we had just whispered over the map. Then my teammate Owen shouted, I'm here, and smashed through the thicket toward a voice that sounded exactly like me. I pulled him back by his pack strap, and the undergrowth closed on the space he'd made. We took a break by a rock house, chewed bland protein bars, drank warm water. I told them what I'd decided. We would treat voices like weather, note them, respect their power, and never argue with them. The forest didn't vote. Another voice landed in the leaves. It knew our inventory, the color of the tape on our GPS, the extra batteries Owen tucked in his shoulder pocket. It knew the sore knee Jasmine hadn't mentioned aloud. It kept perfect pace with us, like something stepping just beyond sight, reading sound and heat and fear and returning them with interest. It sounded tired when tired would make us hurry, panicked when panic would make us dumb. It did not slur, did not crack, did not miss a thing. By mid-afternoon, the calls learned my exact voice. They told my team to split, to triangulate. They said I'd fallen in a rockfall, that I was bleeding, that I was, choose your adjective. The forest had them all. My team's eyes flickered between my face and the brush, as if I might be 2 places at once, and they owed both of me rescue. I could feel the trap shape in the terrain. Gullies that hid drop-offs. Laurel tunnels that hid nothing until you were inside them. Then hid the sky. I put us back on the planned line, and the calls slipped upslope to stay ahead at 50 yards. My own voice cried my full legal name. It listed the bones I had supposedly broken. The cadence was mine, the slight flatness on vowels, the breath at the end of sentences. We pushed toward it anyway, because if there was one chance it was real, we were bound to take it. That oath is the open door in every rescuer's chest, and something knew exactly how to step through. We found gear, a frame pack half-rotted, a laminated card with faded radio codes, an orange tarp stiff with old sun. We found a notebook sealed in a freezer bag. The first page read, "If you're reading this, it already knows you." The journal documented a chase that lasted 4 days and 3 nights. The thing, he never gave it a name, wore every voice it heard, and a few it shouldn't have, like his wife's, like his father's, after the stroke. It moved people the way water moves leaves, by making the easiest route the only one you could imagine. The journal said the voices grew intimate as food grew scarce. They told stories only he knew, offered deals only he wanted. On the last day, the writer recorded a long monologue from himself, asking himself to backtrack to a saddle that wasn't on any map. He went. The last entry was not a sentence. It was coordinates. We camped where the ground widened, and the night would have room to sit without touching us. The calls continued, drifting from a well to our left, from a shadowed cut to our right, then from above, as if the leaves themselves were speaking. I told stories, not to comfort. There wasn't enough comfort to go around, but to occupy the air so the forest had less of it. I told them about the first hiker I ever found alive, a boy who had walked off a trail for the most human reason. He wanted to be somewhere nobody expected him. I told them what the boy said when we carried him out, that the forest had been kind to him until it learned his name. At dawn, our maps felt heavier. Base asked for updates, clipped and professional, and I answered like I hadn't read a man's last coordinates by headlamp. We started away from the worst of the voices. They followed anyway, changing elevation to match ours, adopting new angles like light. 3 hours later, we hit a slope so steep the trees grew like ladder rungs. And that is where the forest made its last offer. My voice shouted from below, raw and righteous. "Henrik, you left them." It used plural, not singular, because guilt is a choir. It said the 3 missing hikers were alive down there, that they'd found a flat spot by running water, that one of them had a wound that would go septic without help. It's hard to teach a spine not to climb toward suffering. Owen argued to go. Jasmine argued to go. Mara, quiet as lichen until then, said, "It studies us. We're giving it a test." I don't remember the exact words I used to counter the forest. I remember the shape of the decision. A line drawn with the least romantic tool on earth. A pencil. We would not descend. We would move toward high ground and safe extraction and report the anomalies like we report weather. We would become boring prey. Owen went anyway. Then Jasmine, because she wouldn't let him go alone. Mira stayed with me because someone had to. Their headlamps bit the green, and then were gone. The voice congratulated me on my choice. Mine. The one that stayed. Mine. The one that would live to write forms. It promised to return the others if I bargained properly. It talked to me about my mother's morning prayers and the hollow in my apartment wall that I never patched because the hole felt honest. It told me the weight of my name. I talked back, not to it, but to Mira. I said we were going to walk like we were lost from the world and not from ourselves. Up and west. Up and west. It's a stupid mantra until it saves you. We moved through thickets that combed us thin, over rocks that remembered oceans. The calls kept pace for another hour, then shifted away like a predator that realizes it's burning calories. It won't be paid back. At the ridge, we turned the radio to weather band and let impersonal sentences wash us clean. We followed the spine toward the nearest signed trail, and by late evening, the woods became a place rather than a plan. At the trailhead, Base's headlights looked like the first true stars. The report we filed was excellent bureaucracy. Boxes ticked, times noted. Possible acoustic anomalies. Unconfirmed third-party transmissions. I asked for a return to search for our people. I got it. For 3 weeks, teams scoured drainages and ridges, mapped out hazard zones, flagged old campsites. We found a boot sole, a torn strap, the plastic shell of a headlamp. The woods kept the rest. I didn't resign. Resigning would make what I heard central to my life in a way that felt like worship. I took quieter assignments. I learned to love the parts of the job with fluorescent lights and stale coffee. I learned to hear the difference between need and lure in a stranger's voice. Some nights, I stand at the overlook and watch the green ocean breathe, and I say the names of the ones we didn't bring home. I don't say them out loud. If you go with people who love boredom more than drama. Go with a plan that refuses ransom. Treat the forest like a cathedral that has never liked singing. When a voice you trust tells you exactly what you ache to hear, ask yourself, who benefits if you obey? Then, do the one merciful thing this place respects. Deny it your attention. There is a sympathy the mountains offer if you stop trying to make them speak. It sounds like wind, but isn't. It sounds like water, but isn't. It sounds like the quiet you earned when you walked away from an answer that wanted to own you. I keep that quiet close now. It doesn't say my name. Story number 9. I stepped into a crime scene older than my parents and found the blood refusing to dry. The calendar said October 2023. The dirt insisted it was November 1952. My microphone caught voices that used prices, threats, and slang 3 generations out of date. When the gunman finally looked at me, the loop looked back. I learned that some wounds in time don't scab. They recruit. The blood at the 1952 crime scene was still wet when I found it in October 2023. And the killer was still there, finishing what he'd started 71 years ago. I didn't go searching for a miracle. I went hunting for a story. My name is Jiraiya, the son of a quiet house and a louder curiosity. I make a small living turning dead cases into late-night radio, stitching old paper with present breath. I'd spent 6 months following the dry trail of moonshine wars in the Blue Ridge, federal agents with thin budgets, men in the hollows with thicker jars, and a map stippled by graves where no one confessed. I was 33 and still foolish enough to believe time is a fence instead of a door. I hiked into Shenandoah with a pack full of batteries and skepticism. The trail was unofficial, a shoulder-width crease between rhododendron and memory. The ridge rolled like a sleeping animal, ancient and indifferent. I passed foundations swallowed by moss, glass melted by brush fires, and the islanded smell of copper lingering where water once boiled into contraband. The deeper I walked, the narrower the present felt. I kept thinking of how the old reports spoke about territory, the way cartographers speak about coastlines, erasable only in theory. I had obtained permission to visit the historical crime scene as part of my podcast research, hiking to a remote location deep in the park where the ruins of the illegal distillery were still visible among the trees. The permission felt ceremonial, like being allowed to touch a tomb that still breathed. The ruins were not ruins. The planks didn't groan. They held. The copper didn't flake. It shone in narrow veins where the light found it. There were footprints that weren't mine and cigarette butts with brands I associated with black and white photographs. Time had forgotten to finish the job here. I started recording because that's my reflex when reason blinks. I described the slope, the creek no wider than a boot, the buckets stacked by the sill, the comb in a windowsill, as if its owner might return with wet hair, the copper stills and wooden buildings that housed the illegal operation showed minimal rust and rot. I crouched beside a stain, dark as molasses, and realized it was neither shadow nor memory. It was blood deciding to be fresh again. The air had the tang of iron and ferment, of work interrupted and resumed by hands who didn't care which year the calendar sold. Then came the voices. I didn't hear slang. I heard grammar that had not yet learned our decade. Men argued about mash yields and roots. They named cousins who would never own a smartphone. Their talk was transactional, like card players who knew the deck had been stacked hours ago, but kept betting because pride is an expensive liquor. The voices were using language and expressions that belonged to the 1950s rather than contemporary speech patterns. My camera's timestamp read 01:57:09 on the audio track. The forest insisted on a different clock. I saw them before I believed them. Men dressed in clothing and using equipment that belonged to the Prohibition era. Suspenders, wool caps, a revolver polished by necessity. The men moved with the physical certainty of people who know where each board will be tomorrow, because tomorrow has already happened. They didn't see me, or they saw me the way fish see constellations, present and irrelevant. It was like watching a film that had learned to ignore its audience. I realized I wasn't in a reenactment when the argument shifted registers. From commerce to tactics, they began checking weapons, not for show, but for survival. They were preparing for some kind of confrontation that they expected to occur at a specific time. Numbers were spoken. Names were set aside in favor of positions. A tall man tapped a wristwatch that couldn't possibly be connected to my satellites. He said, "Keep your head. They'll come from the draw." A cigarette trembled at the end of another man's mouth, not from fear, but from anticipation. The way a runner trembles at a starting line. I should have left. Every instinct said I was counting backward to zero. But stories have gravity, and I orbit them. I thought maybe I could be a historian of an event as it reoccurred, a witness to a loop that kept choosing the same ending. When the attacking moonshiners arrived at exactly the time indicated in the historical records, I watched the massacre unfold with the same brutal efficiency that had been documented in the original crime scene reports. I braced myself, as if bracing could matter. The first shot didn't startle me. It organized me. I tracked voices, angles, footfalls, the geometry of fear. Men who had joked 5 minutes earlier, folded as neatly as laundry. Executions are not theatrical. They are administrative. The attackers moved like accountants of death, balancing columns with lead and certainty. The moonshiners were trapped in a cycle that forced them to relive their final day over and over again. It was a scene that had already happened, was happening, and would happen again. A cruelty that comforted no one except the rhythm itself. There is a difference between seeing and being seen. During the third body, the leader of the attacking crew turned his head like a man noticing weather. The most terrifying moment of my entire experience came when the leader of the attacking group noticed my presence during the killing and realized that I was not part of the original timeline. His eyes found the zipper on my modern jacket, the glass in my lens, the way I held my shoulders. Recognition is a key. It unlocked me from being a ghost. The loop moved aside to make room for me. He advanced without shouting, because shouting is for men who need distance. He did not ask who I was. He assessed what I was. A breach. I ran, because that's what the living do when the past decides it wants company. The killer began pursuing me through the forest with the same methodical determination that he had used to execute the 7 moonshiners. Roots grabbed my ankles. Branches wrote signatures on my jacket. I cut left where the creek curved, as if the bend could hide me from mathematics. He pursued like a ledger, closes, inevitably, as I fled. The forest kept vomiting up artifacts that didn't belong to October 2023. A lunch pail with warm bread, steam. A newspaper announcing games long since played. A boot print soft with an hour I could name if I dared. The present was a lean animal. The past was fat and hungry. In the gap between breaths, I understood something both simple and ruinous. The loop used anchors, and anchors can be lifted back at the still, the gleaming organ that turned grain into courage. I found the copper component I'd noticed earlier, heavy as a sentence. Its surface held a fingerprint that refused to oxidize. My escape from the temporal crime scene happened only when I managed to remove physical evidence from the distillery operation, taking a copper component from one of the stills that seemed to serve as an anchor point for the temporal loop. The leader closed within 10 steps, then 8, then the kind of distance where men either kill or talk. He intended the former. I did the latter. I spoke a name I'd learned from a park report, spoke it the way a priest does, not to reach a man, but to reach the structure around him. For one breath, his face unlearned the certainty it wore. I tore the copper free. Sound didn't stop. Sequence did. The men were still there, and then they weren't. Like a word erased from a blackboard that leaves dust but not meaning. And the removal of this object caused the entire 1952 scenario to collapse back into normal historical time, leaving me alone in the ruins of a 71-year-old crime scene. The blood dried so fast, it felt like a lie I had told myself. The cigarette burned down into a smear that could have been from any decade. Even the footprints adopted the slumped posture of age. I walked out different, in a way only I could inventory. The Park Service took my gear and my statements and my right to be believed. The Park Service confiscated my recording equipment and podcast research materials after I reported my experience, and the historical distillery site was permanently closed to researchers and visitors. I slept badly in a motel that had learned to be clean but not kind. The copper sat on the dresser, wrapped in a t-shirt like contraband and sacrament. The messages began 3 days later. No return address, no signature, just instructions disguised as warnings. Keep away from wounds you can't suture. Don't turn the public toward places that the universe keeps bandaged with repetition. You got lucky, one note said, which made me laugh without sound. Luck being a word for outcomes we hate to quantify. The last message was a photograph of my front door, time-stamped with yesterday. The caption said only, "Time doesn't like being handled." I considered telling my listeners everything. I drafted an episode where I explained loops the way meteorologists explain pressure systems. Inevitable, circular, and occasionally murderous. But I kept cutting the script down until it became a confession to myself. I am part of an artifact. I didn't free those men. I only interrupted their schedule. If time is a bruise, I pressed a thumb into it and then left. Now the copper lives in a safe deposit box I pay for in cash. When I hold it, it warms as if remembering work. I tell myself that if I keep it hidden, the loop will stay broken. But I have learned that broken is not the opposite of working in the economy of time. Broken is a function with additional steps. Sometimes at night, I hear the rhythm of liquid cycling through pipes that are not in my apartment. I turn on the recorder on reflex, and then I don't press any buttons. I go back to the mountains sometimes, not to the same spot. Those coordinates feel like sharing a password, but to other hollows where the air is dense with decisions. I look for seams where the present was clumsily sewn to yesterday. I look for blood that refuses to brown. I tell myself I am done with loops while planning how to step around them, the way a man quits drinking with a bottle in the cabinet for company. I tell myself I'm investigating stories, but stories are investigating me back. On the worst days, I picture the leader's eyes, learning me, and wonder which of us escaped. If you ask what I believe now, I will say this: murder is not only an event. Sometimes it is a technology, a means to press the world into a circle until the exit resembles the entrance. I don't know who engineered that still to be an anchor, or whether the anchor was an accident, or whether time itself sometimes refines people into ghosts, the way liquor refines grain into something that burns long after the match is out. I only know that the copper is quiet, and that quiet can be menacing. Once, last week, I caught the smell again, ferment and iron, on a city street, impossible as a summer blizzard. I followed it into an alley and found nothing except a puddle shaped like a watch face, a circle with no hands. I stood there long enough for the shop owner to peek out and ask if I was lost. I said no, but I meant yes. I meant that I had lost the map that promised one direction of travel. I meant that sometimes a day doesn't end. It folds. If you want advice, if this becomes an episode and not a confession, here it is. Tread lightly around histories that resist conclusion. If a place seems to be waiting for actors, do not audition. If you must touch an anchor, do it with the understanding that you may unmoor more than a loop. There are crimes that ended and crimes that continue, and the difference is not always legal or moral. Sometimes the difference is architectural. Sometimes the difference is copper. I keep the recorder close now, not to document, but to remind myself that I live in a line, not a circle. The red light is a talisman against orbits. When I sleep, I dream in straight roads, and in the morning, I wake to a phone that vibrates without messages, a door that locks without satisfying me, and a mountain range visible from my window, only if I lean far enough to risk falling. That is how I live now, leaning toward a horizon, careful not to loop, and the knowledge that some murders create wounds in time itself that continue bleeding across decades until someone disrupts the patterns that keep past violence alive in the present. They never charged anyone for the massacre. They never will. The suspects are archived in a geometry that doesn't recognize arraignments. On paper, I am a podcaster who trespassed on legend. Off paper, I am a man who once carried a hinge in his pocket and learned that doors cut both ways. If you see me on a trail with a small metal weight tugging at my steps, don't ask me what it is. Ask me what it does, and then don't wait for the answer. Story number 10. I spent a lifetime learning where the hills breathe and where the soil keeps secrets. The roots I prized most rose from a darkness no farmer should cultivate. Someone charted my footsteps and planted their dead-like seed. When the spades turned, the forest finally spoke. It called me by my name, Kellen. I learned the trade from my grandfather, a slow-spoken man who weighed seasons in his palm and could read shade like a compass. He taught me to move before dawn, to study the lay of a slope, and to recognize the hush that means a patch is near, ferns whispering over cool dirt, bead-like rainfall dried too slowly under a dense canopy, the quiet clustering of partner species that hint at a patient treasure underfoot. By the time I was old enough to share a thermos with him, my feet knew the ridge spines and ravines of the border country the way a river knows its own bed. I learned to leave more than I took. I learned to walk home with mud behind the nails and a conscience untroubled. In September of 2021, I was 61, past the age when pride wins arguments with the body. A man starts taking fewer chances then. I favored familiar slopes, the ones my father called the keepers, and I carried the old rules like a pocket Bible. Never exhaust a patch, never mark a trail, never bring a stranger. That year, the plants were extraordinary. Crowns fuller, stems thicker, the leaves holding a darker green long after they should have thinned. The roots felt alive in my hands, dense as a clenched fist, age rings stacking into the kind of knotted geometry that buyers fawn over. I had no right to find so much quality in 1 month. I had no reason to expect the forest to be so generous. Generosity in these mountains has a cost. Even before I knew the price, I could sense a difference under the trowel. The soil ran nearly black and held together with a kind of gummy cohesion that wasn't humus alone. It yielded reluctantly, and then too easily, like a confession that had rehearsed itself. I told myself it was a quirk of drainage, a fluke of decaying laurel, and a lucky pocket of nutrients. I told myself a lot of things, and none of them stood up to the weight of what I began to dig from the edges. At first, it was a button, cheap, earth-stained. Then a strip of nylon threading, a zipper tooth, a laminated corner peeled from a card that had meant something to someone. The mountain doesn't keep plastic long. It finds a way to push it out the way a body forces a thorn to the surface. I began to notice the pattern tucked into the topography. The sweetest plants were anchored above subtle depressions, hollows a little too even, as if a boot heel had tamped the last scoop of dirt and the rain had done the smoothing. When I widened the hole at one of my best patches, I found a belt buckle. I sat back on my heels and let the woods breathe through me. Then I pulled the buckle free, brushed away the dirt, and saw engraved initials that didn't belong to anyone I knew. Cherokee National Forest can make a man feel as if the world ends 20 minutes from his back porch. It is not a place for bright explanations. I began to return with small flags and a habit of marking edges no one else would even see. I told myself I needed to track the fertility, that maybe some wind-dropped ash or a long-ago fire had fed these places richer than the rest. The truth kept curling around the edges of my thoughts and refusing to look me in the eye. I am a stubborn man. I prefer the patient answer. But the patient answer was not coming. Maps help when honesty doesn't. I sketched the ridges the way I had as a young man. Thin pencil lines for spurs, cross-hatching where the hollows turned inward, dots for the patches that had fed my family for decades. Then I added the new fertility, the north-facing coves, the shaded bowls where the plants had suddenly grown with a vigor you do not see without a reason. The dots formed a line, not organic at all, but chosen, selected. I followed them with my boots and found the same story told in different accents. The disturbed surface, the denser loam, the artifacts pressing upward, a coin, a hair clip, a buckle. The mountain was naming strangers to me. I chose a morning that held its cold a little later and came back with a heavier spade. I prayed before I dug, not because I knew what I would find, but because I feared it. I cut a clean rectangle and rolled it like a carpet. The smell did not come. The time had already done its quiet work. All that remained under the roots was cloth reduced to threads and a dark outline of where a person ends up when the world has no plans for the rest of them. I sank to my knees and counted my breath. Something in the back of my mind searched for dates, for more than 2 decades, for the faces on flyers tacked to country store corkboards, edges curled, eyes fading in the sun. I am not a detective. I am a man who listens to water and wind and chooses when to slide a blade into the earth. But there are crimes the earth can't keep, not when the roots are thirsty and the hands above them are curious. Over the next weeks, I found observation posts tucked into laurel thickets, rough seats impressed into the leaves, branches clipped to create quiet lanes of sight. I found stones stacked where no one stacks stones, unless they are counting or warning. I found newer dirt laid atop older sorrow, and I understood that someone had been following me, timing work to mine. aligning their buried choices with my calendar, using the gently dependable cadence of my seasons to hide their own. I kept counting. I started leaving earlier, stepping where the ground had memory, saving my heaviest work for the hour when cold shadows pull longer. I do not scare easy, but caution is a craft, and I polished it daily. The plants didn't care how they were fed. They took what they were offered, and they rewarded the offer with power folded into a root. Buyers whispered numbers. I said less than I was thinking, and more than I wanted. American ginseng travels far for a promise. The promise was fat that year, and I hated it. He stepped out at a place I call the shoulder, a rise between two bowls where the wind lines up and points you home. He wasn't big the way a story makes a man big. He was ordinary, in the way a fence post is ordinary, in the way habits stand upright and hold their shape. He knew enough not to smile. He nodded like we were neighbors meeting over a borrowed tool. In his hand was a trowel with a clean edge. Behind him, the ground showed a rectangle the color of wet coffee. "You're early," he said, as if we had a schedule. "I am," I answered, because denying a fact to a man like that is a waste of breath. I kept my eyes on his hands and counted the paths away from that bowl. The right-hand ridge hooks into a granite spine and then breaks. The left drops into a creek that pretends to be shallow. He had chosen the place with care. He had chosen me with care. He knew my harvesting rhythm down to the week. He lifted one shoulder toward the pit. "When the roots fatten, the story ends for them," he said. But here, the story begins with the root. I will not record all his words. Some ideas don't deserve more oxygen than they already stole. But I will tell you what he believed. That a person's end is a kind of ingredient. That bodies given to the soil decomposition become medicine. And that medicine pays. That maps like mine are invitations. That the market is cold enough to turn anything into calculus. He talked about timing, about wintering in, about the interval between my visits, about how the microclimate in these bowls favored the transformation he required. He used the word optimization like an accountant. He used my family as a tool to sharpen his knife. If I showed up in September of 2021, he would have buried in late spring. If I favored the north-facing coves, he would choose them first. If I climbed to between 3,000 and 4,000 round feet, he would select his pits there. He had the calm of a man who believes the world is a chart, and he is its author. Fear asks for speed and gets men broken. I asked for sight instead, the kind my grandfather taught me. Notice where the dust collects, where the bark is scarred, where the leaf litter tells a boot's size. The man in front of me had moved through this stand often. He had trimmed branches where I ducked without thinking. He had left me nothing accidental. The only luck I owned was the luck of knowing these woods the way children know their mother's voice. The shoulder hides a seam in the land, a game trail that looks wrong if you don't already love it. I turned while he was still speaking and started down that seam. He did not chase immediately. Predators who believe themselves inevitable take their time. I used mine. The seam feeds into a draw that nobody visits, then into a creek that masks careful steps, then into a rockfall that teaches ankles not to trust themselves. I had traveled this route in storms and droughts, and in the sullen mood that comes with being proved wrong. I slipped and caught myself and kept the breath behind my teeth. I took the long way to a slope that hands you a signal bar if you ask nicely. The phone felt like a sinful miracle. I told the dispatcher to send men who weren't afraid to walk. By the week's end, there were flags in colors I had never needed. Blue for remains, red for buried artifacts, yellow for the lines someone had planned to follow. There were patient men with careful hands, and women who wrote down the small details like they meant everything. Because out here, small details are the only things that do. The count climbed faster than my gut could stand it. 12, then 15, then more than 20. They worked for days, and then weeks, crossing state lines, taking my maps, adding their own, tracing what we had all missed, because we wanted to believe the ground keeps only what it grows. I still walk the ridges. I still turn over leaves and search the green for the shape of the plant I love. But I have new rules now. I refuse patches that surge too fast. I kneel longer before I cut. I treat every gift as a question. When I do take a root, I lay it in my palm and feel for what the soil tried to tell me. And I refused to hear. We were never partners, he and I. That was a story he liked, because it made his arithmetic neat. The truth is simpler and more demanding. You do not measure a harvest by weight alone. You measure it by what it took from the living and what it asked of the dead. On certain mornings, the mountains are quiet enough to hear your own name coming back from them. On certain mornings, the map in your head refuses to line up with the map under your boots. On certain mornings, you can admit what you were slow to see. I carry those mornings like a second spine. They keep me upright. I met with families who had waited so long, their hope became a kind of furniture in the room. Present, familiar, almost invisible until you bump into it. I brought them what I could. Maps marked with circles, dates layered over weather histories, a hand-drawn line where I had walked 100 times, thinking the world was only trees and time. Some of them thanked me. Some of them couldn't look at me without flinching. Both reactions were honest. I had spent a lifetime being exact about ridges and careless about people. The harvest ledger keeps more than weights and prices. It keeps names, even when you refuse to read them. There are men who walk into woods to be left alone. There are men who walk into woods because they believe the woods will excuse them. I am not naive enough to think one arrest ended the second kind, but I am stubborn enough to think the first kind can make their lives into a kind of resistance. Learning, noticing, refusing to make the land complicit. The old ways can be a shield if you choose it. Take only what proves itself ready. Leave a patch better than you found it. Travel without leaving a straight line behind you. Teach your grandchildren that wealth is not a pile of cured roots in a shed, but the skill to find them again in 10 years, and the humility to walk past the ones that feel wrong. I kept one root from that year, one with a body like a clenched hand and a crown that looked almost like a face turned away. I do not sell it. I do not grind it for tea or trade it for favors. I set it on a shelf where I keep difficult truths. When the season turns, and the air sharpens, and the phone starts humming with buyers, I sit in front of that shelf and ask the single question that keeps me honest. What is this worth if the cost is hidden from me? Some answers are number. Others are not. The forest knows both kinds, and in the end, so do I. Some nights, the wind moves through the laurel, like someone walking. I do not turn to look anymore. I listen until the sound passes, and the leaves are only leaves again. Then I put one foot in front of the other and go home. Story number 11. The storm taught me that mercy can open a door you spend the rest of your life trying to close. 8 days of white erased the world. And in that blankness, something ancient walked into my cabin wearing a man's face. I believed isolation would keep evil out. I learned it only makes the knocking louder. Even now, when the wind climbs the ridge, I taste iron on my tongue and count the distance to the nearest human voice. This is the account I leave behind, so that if I fail myself, someone else understands why the matches are always within reach. I'm Coulson. I keep my sentences simple these days, because complicated thoughts split like ice under a thaw. Back then, I had routines strong enough to anchor a winter. The cabin sat on a shoulder of limestone and spruce, 60 miles from anything that sold gas or aspirin. I could read the sky as if it were a calendar. When the barometer stooped and the birds went inland, I stacked firewood, filled kettles, and salted the steps. I had an old ranger's confidence, the kind you earn by outlasting storms that turn men into memories and roads into rumors. I didn't plan on charity. I planned on silence. My name is Coulson. I had been working as a park ranger for 28 years before retirement steered me into a life as a caretaker of solitude. The place had history burned into its joists. The cabin that my grandfather had built in 1934. And I spent winters living off supplies I stockpiled each autumn. The February blizzard of 1998 came on like judgment, shouldered against the mountains, and the remote Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania became a sheet of moving glass. Spending my winters in complete isolation, 60 miles from the nearest town, I trusted the old rules of weather. Prepare, respect, endure. By the third day, the world outside was a single moving color, depthless and absolute. The stove ticked, snow loaded the roof, and every sound was the storm thinking out loud. That was when the pounding came. 3 strikes, a pause, then a frantic rhythm that did not belong to anyone rationing strength. The sensible thing in that weather is to dig into whatever hollow you can find and wait. Whoever stood on my porch had done the opposite. I opened to a man whose coat didn't belong to the cold. His face had the gray luster of fish left too long on ice. He swayed as if the floor rolled beneath him. Words broke out of him in scraps, names abbreviated to consonants, a trail lost, friends missing. I did what good men do when it's still easy to believe in being one. I hauled him into heat, stripped the ice from his clothes, wrapped him in wool, and signed my name to his life without reading the terms. He was in his 40s, he said, separated from his hiking companions during the early stages of the blizzard, then wandering through the forest for days without food. His hands trembled around the mug I gave him. I prepared hot soup and coffee, Steam fogged his lashes. He ate as if the bowl were running away from him. On the first night, I told myself he was just unusually hungry, the way the lost tend to be when they've been arguing with the dark and losing. On the second night, I woke to a vibration in the floorboards and a sound of teeth on ice. In the kitchen, I found him hunched at the open freezer, barehanded, face shining with thaw. He was tearing into frozen steaks with his bare hands and teeth, and the look he gave me over his shoulder was not embarrassment. It was possession. Hunger makes saints into thieves, and thieves into something that doesn't bother with names. He tried to dress it up in words. Deprivation, survival, cravings that couldn't wait for a skillet. But I had watched animals lose fear and cross a porch like it was a meadow. What stood in my kitchen wore a man's outline, yet everything about the posture said predator at kill in the daylight. What passed for it? The snow relented to a pale exhale, and I inventoried his pack while he slept like a dropped stone. A ranger's habit. Learn a stranger by the things he carries. I found wallets that argued with one another, different faces, different signatures, film canisters in a sock, a camera with frost sifting the viewfinder. The metal tags on a tent roll didn't match the boots he wore. When I asked, he said the storm had scattered gear across the trees, that he had collected what he could because nobody else would come back for it. The story weighed the same as a lie. He became evasive, spoke in explanations inconsistent enough that even compassion couldn't excuse them. The storm pressed us together until the cabin turned small, and the windows turned into mirrors at night. Every time he crossed the room, I learned a new stagger in my own step. On the third day, his body began to edit itself. The black line of frostbite along his fingertips receded in hours. Scabs vanished into fresh skin. Knuckles thickened, as if something inside was fitting them for different work. His teeth showed more when he smiled, as if the gums had shrunk away from them to offer better purchase. His fingernails were growing at an abnormal rate. His eyes had developed a predatory focus. The ranger in me reached for facts and found only folklore with the serial numbers filed off. The woodshed settled the argument. I went out for more kindling and opened the wrong lid. Every hunter knows the difference between quartered venison and what a man looks like when someone has decided his limbs are just meat. The parts were wrapped, as if they were going to last a season. I didn't shout. I didn't drop anything. I closed the lid, stood there with my hands hanging at my sides, and understood the slope I'd been walking was not ice. It was a throat back inside. He was waiting at the table with his hands folded, the way you sit when a teacher calls your name. We did not circle it. We didn't pretend. I told him what I had found. He watched my mouth as if gauging bite force. When he spoke, it was a weather report delivered by someone who had outlived the town. He explained that a winter long ago had pressed him against hunger so hard it altered the fittings. He had been forced to consume human flesh to survive. And something in that act had triggered changes in his body and mind. Food no longer answered unless it answered in one voice. He described enhanced strength, speed, and sensory capabilities that made taking what he needed easier. The price was that ordinary food turned to ash in his mouth. The The more he fed, the more the changes became more pronounced and permanent. The body kept the score and demanded the same chorus. Then he told me the part that took the roof off the sky. It spreads, not like a germ in the blood, like a song your bones learn. Long exposure, shared spaces, breath in the same stale room. The choreography of hunger performed in front of you until your own gut applauds. The longer someone lived with him, the less other food did its job. The mind bent first. Intrusive thoughts, interested disgust, curiosity that put a chair closer to the monster. Then the body, in little betrayals, a heat in the molars that wasn't pain, a quickness that didn't feel like youth, sleep that left you staring at hands you were trying not to imagine as cuts of meat. I wish I could say I disbelieved him. The truth is simpler and worse. I already knew he was right. I had started watching the fat on my palm, where a knife would enter if it had to. I had started thinking in pounds. The white outside kept us, and inside the air thickened with the idea of meat. I tried to cook as if meals could build a fence. He ate as if fences were appetizers. He told me that he had been surviving in the mountains for more than a decade, choosing trails where people vanish into weather and paperwork. He said the disappearances would be attributed to natural disasters or wilderness accidents. He said they, the way farmers talk about cattle, fondly, practically, already measuring. That night, I set a cot by the door and slept with my boots on. Sleep found me by mistake and left claw marks. When I woke, I tasted iron and realized I had been biting my tongue in my dreams. There are confessions that don't seek forgiveness. They're maps to the same mistake. On the 8th morning, the storm loosened its teeth. The sky went from cathedral to canvas. The ridge showed itself in ribs. He slept heavy, full as a banked stove. I took my snowshoes, a coil of rope, a tin of matches, and the photograph of my grandfather holding up a stringer of trout. Then I stood by the table and looked at the thing that had chosen my shelter, and I spoke to him as if he could still be saved in grammar. I have to go. He didn't wake. Too much feeding makes even monsters trust naps. I left a trail I didn't intend to ever walk back. The world returned to edges and distance, felt like an accusation. I moved slow to keep from sweating. Down the hollow, the drifts had mounded into the shapes of men lying on their sides. I didn't step on them. It felt like bad luck. Half a mile from the cabin, I turned and saw only weather. That was the last mercy the mountain gave me. I did not report a creature or a curse. I reported a propane explosion during the blizzard when I finally reached a ranger station that remembered my name. The snow would make evidence academic, and I needed the cabin to be burned to the ground from a safe distance for reasons no form could hold. Fire is the final disinfectant we're allowed without a permit. Flames took the boards my grandfather had shaped with his patient hands. I stood far enough away to live with myself. I have lived alone since. 25 winters, counting wrong on purpose. I check my nails. I time how fast cuts close. I keep fresh meat in the house to make other meat less interesting. Some nights, the wind climbs the ridge, and I notice that normal food is beginning to seem inadequate. And I sit at the table with my hands folded, so I have to look at them while I decide not to move. I don't let company cross my threshold. I don't let pity open doors. People like to end with hope. I have matches instead. If I fail, it ends here, clean as fire in new snow, because some hungers, once awakened, never completely disappear, and civilized behavior becomes insufficient to suppress the biological imperatives waiting under our coats. He had become something that existed in the liminal space between human and monster. And I learned that space has room for one more chair if you let yourself sit down. I'm still standing.